Welcome to Backwoods University, a place where we focus on wildlife, wild places, and the people who dedicate their lives to conserving both. On this episode, I want to tell you about Bobwhite Quail, a bird that once covered the entire North American continent in abundance, and the hunting culture centered completely around them, that now has almost been completely forgotten. It's late January. I'm in North Mississippi, and the sound that you're hearing is me hiking through the woods. I've been at this all day with a new friend of mine and his dog. We're out hunting, but we're not here hunting deer, we're not here hunting ducks, we're not even here hunting squirrels. In fact, the few other hunters that we've crossed paths with today gave us odd looks when we told them what we were here after.
What's the most cubbies you found in a day, you said? Two. And both of them pretty sizable cubbies, you said?
Yeah. There's two cubbies in here, according to when I came in September. One was farther over that way, one was right over here. And I'm quite surprised we didn't push them, because they usually, we'll make a circle and come out the wind will be in our favor. Come on.
What we're hunting is bobwhite quail, an animal that has called this place, this state, this continent home since before any of us were alive on this earth. But unfortunately, these days can be tough to find. Our mission today is simple: find wild quail. We're in an area where there still remains a huntable population. We hiked onward, following the dog through every thorn, bramble, and cane thicket that she could find, until eventually she went on point, letting us know she had found a bird.
Oh yeah, some birds are there.
What you're hearing now is us making a game plan as to how to approach the dog on point and flush the bird. This can be extremely tricky, putting ourselves in position for a good shot given the type of thickets these birds call home. This next part, flushing the bird, is almost unbearably suspenseful. You don't know where it's going to happen, you don't know when it's going to happen, you just walk towards the dog waiting for the forest floor to erupt under your feet. And you better be ready.
Wow.
I'm glad it worked out, at least that.
That's my fault. I was more mesmerized with the bird than anything, I think. Wow.
I stood there motionless, in awe of what I had just seen. A single quail exploded out of that sea of thorny vines, flew right over the top of my head, and disappeared back into the brush so quickly that the whole incident became a memory quicker than I could even process the fact that I had missed. We both missed. And frankly, I don't think either of us cared. But here's the big picture of all this. Like I mentioned earlier, bobwhite quail are native here. They've called this entire continent home for a long time. There's research that even has them on the landscape up to 1 million years ago. That means that bobwhite quail were flying and whistling the same time that woolly mammoths and ground sloths were still roaming around. That is wild to me. And at one point, not too long ago, there was so many that we had an entire hunting culture built around them. And now, in 2025, they've been reduced to a fraction of what once was. And I'm on a mission to find out why. The guy that's going to help us do that is someone you probably already know. His name is Will Primos, and he's been a dear friend and mentor for me for well over a decade. You and I both know Will for spring turkey hunting, elk, whitetails, but I never knew he got his start hunting with bobwhite quail. I'm sitting in Will's office. The room is filled with countless celebrations of the outdoors. Antlers, hand-carved duck decoys, paintings of wild turkeys, countless books. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Will for a long time, but I couldn't help but notice his enthusiasm today. I think he's excited to share this story.
My Uncle Gus was a devoted quail hunter. He had pointers and setters. And I can still remember the setter. Her name was Cheyenne. And I got paid a quarter for school to get up, and he lived like a real third of a mile away. You know, it wasn't very far, but I could get there on my bicycle in no time. I would go over there, run over there, and for a quarter, I got to clean the dog pens. And that started probably when I was about 8 years old.
Will's connection to quail and bird dogs started when he was just a boy in rural Mississippi in the 1950s. Little did he know that this would start a fire that would burn for a lifetime. Here's more from Will about his Uncle Gus.
But his friend was Buck Dearman, and Buck became a fast friend of mine as I grew older. Buck and Gus would go quail hunting in Madison County, which is where we are right now, where I live. Back then was a rural setting, used to be big, huge cotton plantations, rolling cotton plantations. And back then, what they did, the ground was very fertile, had never been farmed or anything. They'd clear it, they'd plant their crops, and when they depleted the nourishment of the soil, they didn't have fertilizer and stuff, they just go clear another patch of land. And that other would grow up. And over the many, many decades and years, Madison County became small, rural farm, vegetable gardens, and people who wanted to live in the country. Fences everywhere, no posted signs. You just pulled up and got out of your car, and it was the perfect quail habitat. I didn't know that at the time. I just thought that was normal.
What Will just told us there is one of the most important parts of this entire story. It's really not even about quail. It's quail habitat. Remember that, because that detail is going to become more relevant later on.
But Buck was very long-legged, and Gus was almost as long-legged. And here this little kid is, and just trying to keep up with them. But to see the dogs work, and they wouldn't let me carry a gun in those early years, but I got to be there and watch the dogs point, watch them shoot. And both of them shot Browning automatics, the old Belgian-made, old humpback, Anyway, my Uncle Gus died a few years ago, but I remember in his home, he had a beautiful den where he would entertain. He was a big businessman. He had entertained, and he had a portrait. He commissioned a portrait to be made of him kneeling down with his shotgun with Cheyenne.
I got a chance to see this painting, and frankly, it's incredible. A square-jawed man with black hair wearing a khaki jacket knelt down with his bird dogs, and I couldn't help but notice how much of a resemblance it had to Will. I think this gives us a really clear picture into how important and valued quail and quail hunting was at the time. I mean, think about it. How many people do you know these days that commission a painter to do a portrait of their duck dog or a deer that they shot? Bobwhite Quail meant something to these people. But what really sticks out to me is the background of this painting. It looks nothing like what Madison County, Mississippi looks like today. Today, it's neighborhoods, business parks, pine plantations. Whether he meant to or not, Will showing us this painting gave us one of the most crucial pieces to this quail puzzle. Its habitat. I now want to hear from a biologist to give us more on this quail story. Mark McConnell is an upland bird professor at Mississippi State University. He starts off by talking about tall timbers. FYI, this is one of the nation's largest quail research centers located in South Georgia.
Some of the early research, I know you know about Tall Timbers Research Station. Well, that research station was started as a response to quail decline, even in that part of the world, right? That book right there on my desk right next to you, that's considered like the Quail Bible. It was like the first really robust study of bobwhite. They started that study. They published it in 1931, but they started it, several years before that.
1931. So they were already seeing declines in 1931?
They were seeing declines in the late 1890s.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
Yeah, you hear a lot of people say, oh, they've been declined since the 60s. Well, the only reason we say that is because the breeding bird survey started in 1966. So that's the first documented decline.
The 1890s? Will was just telling us these incredible quail hunting stories from Mississippi in the 1950s. Now Mark's telling us the decline started 60 years earlier than that. I can't keep up. I want to ask Mark about quail declines and densities.
And there's a fair amount of reasons for that if you think about what was going on in the country and kind of some of the industrial nature of things. Herbert Stoddard said at the time that he thought a bird per acre was as good as you could ever get. And then they found out through time, and tall timbers is a great example of this, you absolutely can get more than a bird per acre. There are places in the Red Hills that can hit a bird and a half, 2 birds per acre. Now, you don't stay there forever. Populations, nothing goes up forever.
Right.
But you can absolutely exceed that density to varying degrees. People would wet their pants over a bird per acre in Mississippi. So kind of the story of quail, if you start at like the 30,000 foot view, the entire landscape changed. Everything we did to the landscape, with very few exceptions, wasn't designed to mess up quail, but it certainly messed up quail. Think about, say, let's go 1890, 1900, somewhere in that, pre-World War I. Think about what the landscape would have looked like. We did not have the green revolution of agriculture yet. We didn't have fescue yet.
Explain what that is.
Oh, the tall fescue. It's a exotic forage grass that we brought over to stabilize soil, and it's a great winter forage because it's a cool season grass. It's a very challenging plant for quail management. So it was before Bermuda grass. It was before Bahia grass. It was before all these exotic forage grasses took over grazing and forage production. It was before we were farming loblolly pine trees, like row crops. That's about the time the national U.S. policy was pretty much anti-fire. Fire was a bad thing, right? So you've got industrialization, you've got expansion, you've got all these things happening over the next several years. And it all kind of just came together and congealed to just create a landscape where quail could not exist at high densities.
That's one thing that it's interesting as I've done some of this digging and some of this research is I'm 32 years old. You take someone a little bit younger than me that grew up in, let's just say Mississippi, because this is where we're at, but this could be applied to much of the Southeast. You take someone that's just a little bit younger than me, then a state of Mississippi that is virtually completely dominated by loblolly pine, plantation pines. And to them,
that's normal.
That's Mississippi. That's our forest composition. That's what the state looks like. And what's wild is you really don't have to go that far back before it was wildly different. It's clear that the landscape changed in the United States dramatically in the 1900s. But why?
You had the Dust Bowl era, and then you had all these conservation type approaches. But most of them were planting, exotic grass to stabilize the soil, which had a kind of initial, there's grass. Then I was like, oh God, it's bad grass, and we kind of regretted it. And then right as you're ramping up in the 60s at the Green Revolution, we figured out, hey, corn is super limited on nitrogen. If we pour nitrogen to it, we could double yields. Then we figured out synthetic herbicide, synthetic fertilizer. And then Earl Betts, who was the Secretary of Agriculture after the Russian wheat crisis, said, hey, get big or get out in terms of agricultural, farm ditch row to ditch row. That was a statement from the Secretary of Agriculture in the United States.
The K-State Radio Network presents an address by the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Dr. Earl Betts.
We must learn in this next generation how to feed as many more people as we have learned to feed since the dawn of history. And do it at a time when there is no new Western Hemisphere to discover, when there are no more prairie sods to plow, when there are no more virgin timber on arable land to cut down. Do it at a time when we're losing arable land to the urban sprawl, to highways. What's the ingredient we're going to put into agriculture then to get this job done? Science, brain power, professional leadership. For our scientists, battle with Mother Nature.
Earl Betts was the United States Secretary of Agriculture from 1971 to 1976. During his time in this role, Betts drastically changed agriculture policy, which had significant impacts on the country's landscape. Some of his more notable acts include getting rid of a program that paid farmers to not plant all of their land, and saying things like get big or get out, and plant fence row to fence row. All of these things carry a synonymous message of urging and incentivizing more land being put into production. Dr. Mark McConnell has more thoughts on this.
And that expanded ag. So you hear a lot of old timers talk about, oh yeah, we used to had a covey over here and we'd go hunt down the fence row when we were kids. Go find a fence row nowadays. There are no fence rows, right? And what fence rows are left, they've got Roundup or they're weed eated, whatever, they're clean. So we took all the fence rows out, then we realized we got bigger, so the combines got bigger and the equipment got bigger. So now you got a 24-row planter when everybody was planting 4-row planters, so the fields got bigger. And as we expanded fields, we took out those margins, those areas, those odd areas that probably weren't the best ground. Or then maybe it separated a fence line or a property boundary. But that's where people were finding quail in the 60s. In Mississippi, I've talked to old timers who were still hunting them pretty hard up into the early 80s. And they said right about the early 80s, they were like, all right, we're not gonna buy a new bird dog.
I was interviewing James Martin, but he said they were on their last bird dog. And I said, dude, that sounds like the title to a very depressing country song. Like, that's a country song, yeah, on my last bird dog.
That would be depressing, but somebody should write that. Yeah.
I can hear the tune in my head right now. Man, that sounds like a Muscadine Bloodline song just waiting to be written. Mark and I are joking here, but many of us have fathers or grandfathers that have stories similar to this that were very real experiences for them. Think back to Will's uncle and his dog Cheyenne. I even have a picture of my own grandfather with his English pointer when he was in his early 30s, quail hunting in Webster County, Mississippi. Those days are gone now. If a fellow was driving around Mississippi these days with an English pointer, he would catch more than a few odd looks, and that is sad to me. But there is hope. Wilbur Primos is one of the guys that's doing something to get quail back on the landscape. You were one of the first people that I can remember that back when you had Rivers Run, you were doing things on that property to promote bobwhite quail.
Yeah. I love conservation and love trying to understand what we did wrong and what caused some of these things not to go the way they could have to keep the tradition alive. Mm-hmm. And there's some people that are restoring them. Well, first off, a lot of it was row crop. It was marginal row crop, dry ground farming. It was not profitable. And so when I bought it, I looked at it, I said, what's a better use for this land? And I ended up meeting a guy named Nick Thomas, who founded a company called Stewart Link that puts conservation on the ground, helps represent the growers to the NRCS, FSA offices. I met with him and said, look, can I put this back into some type of quail habitat? He said, yeah, we can plant warm season native grasses. And we've got experts that'll help show you how to get ready, how to get the ground prepared, it'll take you over a year to get this going and get it planted. There's so much to learn. Mm. You got to have the right kind of planter. You got to choose the different grasses that were native to Mississippi. Mm. So I ended up with blue stem and Indian grass and gamma grass. I mean, we had a few quail. You'd be on a deer stand and you'd hear the quail or you'd see them walk by.
I remember that.
Yeah.
I was amazed. I hadn't seen it. That's the first time. I would have been 22 years old.
Yeah.
And I don't think I had seen a quail since I was like 12.
Yeah.
When I saw those at Rivers Run, and I was amazed.
And they would walk by the edge of the woods.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when we did the grass and we gave them the habitat, I mean, it exploded. So the most fun for me was in the spring to step outside and to see how many males I could count singing. And, there's one. I think my highest I ever got to was 13. Yeah, it was really cool. Mm. Yeah, because you got to burn. You can't burn too much. You burn too often. It gets too thick. That's not good. Mm. Quail need to be able to run around on the ground. They got to run between the clumps of grasses. They got to have escape cover. I planted plums, thickets. I tried to do everything I could. It was fun.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest hurdle is? Because I've talked to several folks about this, and it's like one of the biggest things that they think quail face, just talking about specifically here at home in the Southeast, is that because we talked about, there almost has to be an intentionality about it these days if you're going to have quail on a property. And so to do that, you have to have people, landowners, hunters that are interested in it. And that's kind of a tall order right now because there's not too many places that someone could go and find quail. There's not too many places someone could go and find a good bird dog because you don't see too many people down here riding around with setters and pointers anymore. They're gone for the most part.
That's right. When you lose the resource, you lose a lot that goes with it.
Mm-hmm. If you think about it, and I can get most upland hunters can romanticize about it. We all can. We didn't just lose a bird. We lost an entire hunting culture.
That's right.
And I liken it now, because spring turkey hunting or duck hunting or deer hunting, whatever. And I tell folks, like, imagine it was gone.
Yeah.
All of it's gone. Imagine if you think about deer hunting. Let's talk about deer. But if you take away the deer, then the deer hunting's gone. You know what else is gone? Deer camp.
Deer camp, yeah.
Your weekends at deer camp, watching the football game and grilling out, that's gone now. Stories of you telling your buddies, checking your trail cameras all the time, it's all gone. I'm interested in how wildlife affects humans and human culture. And although much of it is gone now, quail used to dominate the hunting culture of the Southeast. much like deer camps dominate the hunting culture now. It was a different world, truly. Here's Will on how he and his family used to celebrate quail season.
There were a good many of guys like that, and they would have dinners over at Gus's house after season. They'd have a big quail dinner and invite all their friends that do it. I don't know how prevalent it was. You hear a lot of people that you meet today. I'm in my 70s, and you hear a lot of people talk about, their daddies and that are my age. So, we're almost one generation past it, because it was the generation before me that had the quantity and the quality and had that opportunity.
I don't know about y'all, but I would give an awful lot to be able to go back in time and attend one of those quail dinners at Will's uncle's house. And while I could continue on about the plight of the bobwhite quail and the long-lost hunting culture, I think it's important to point out that there is a silver lining. Here in the past 10 years, there's been a resurgence, not just in quail, but in people. People like you, people like me, people with an interest in quail, quail habitat, and quail hunting.
It's a different landscape, but where people are trying, they've got quail. That's kind of the resounding message of hope is, if you've got them, and you've got some acreage, and you've got some buddies next to you that'll help out, there's a lot of things you can do to keep them. I think everyone talks about, and it's a terribly depressing story of the quail. It really is. But the longer I've been doing this, I'm like, you know what? Yeah, it's depressing, but it's also pretty inspiring. The fact that I can go to Rankin County. I did a site visit in Rankin County with John Mark Curtis, our Quail Forever state biologist. We did a site visit, 2 years ago now, and the guy had some pines, not many, couple hundred acres. He was burning them and thinning them. His neighbor had a tornado come through. I think it was a hardwood stand, and just ripped it, and he salvaged it. It was like a nice little clear cut. There were quail singing everywhere in Rankin County, not far off a major highway. And we're driving back, and he said something pretty cool. He's like, just about anywhere in this state, if people try, they can get quail. Now, they're not going to get a bird per acre. But this guy, I think he texted John Mark earlier or late last year saying, oh yeah, went out hunting with the dog and found a few coveys. He was elated. He could not have been happier. And he wasn't doing anything all that unique anymore. I mean, he just thinned his pines and was lighting some fires every 2 years.
So you're basically saying that the narrative of the bobwhite quail here in the Southeast, rather than the plight of the bobwhite quail, it should be more of like, look at this bird that refuses to give up.
That's right. The resilience of bobwhite to hang on. Now, they've been locally expatriated from, or, there's areas where you're not going to find them, whatever. There's plenty of that. Mm-hmm. So the story that I like to focus on now, yes, we need to teach the historical demise, but the fact that these things are still around with everything we put against them, I mean, it's amazing.
A bird that just won't give up. Now that's a story I can get behind. So let's take a quick look back at what we learned this week. Bobwhite quail have been kicking around on this continent for roughly 1 million years, meaning they crossed paths with and outlasted animals like the woolly mammoth and the ground sloth. I still think that's wild. We used to have them in great abundance until the first notable declines in the 1890s. However, quail populations and quail hunting remained good up into the 1950s and 60s. And then, due to multiple factors such as agricultural expansion, urban sprawl, habitat loss, and many others, quail declines got worse. But, like we just mentioned, this bird just refuses to quit. I want to thank all of you for listening to Backwoods University, as well as Beargrease and This Country Life. And I want to give a big shout out to Onyx Hunt for making this podcast possible. Next time, we're going to learn what the future of bobwhite quail could look like and what people like you and me can do to help keep them around.